Most people misunderstand sensitivity because they only evaluate what they can see on the surface. They hear someone speak carefully, notice hesitation, emotional awareness, or a pause before responding, and they immediately translate that into fragility, as if depth must always come with weakness, as if awareness must mean instability. But what they fail to recognize is that an empath is not reacting more, they are processing more. And those are not the same thing. An empath does not simply listen to words, they absorb the structure behind the words, the tone that carries them, the timing that reveals hesitation, the subtle inconsistencies that most people ignore because they are focused only on content, not delivery. And this creates a very different internal experience, one where every interaction is layered, not just with meaning, but with intention, alignment, and emotional data that is often invisible to everyone else in the room. There was a moment I remember observing during a conversation between two people who, on the surface, seemed completely aligned. The exchange was polite, the language was controlled, nothing outwardly disruptive. But if you paid attention closely, there was a slight delay before one of them answered a simple question. Not long enough to be obvious, just enough to register subconsciously. And most people move past it without a second thought. But one person didn't. They didn't interrupt. They didn't challenge. They simply went quiet. And that silence wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Something didn't match. Not logically, but emotionally. And while others needed evidence to validate what they were hearing, this person had already registered a discrepancy before it could even be articulated. This is where the misunderstanding begins. Because from the outside, the empath appears uncertain, overly cautious, sometimes even hesitant, but internally, they are mapping a much more complex picture, one that includes not just what is being said, but what is being avoided, not just the message, but the intention behind the message. And when those elements align, trust forms naturally. There is no need to question, no need to analyze, because everything fits. But when they don't align, when the words suggest one thing and the emotional tone suggests another, the empath does not ignore that gap. They focus on it, not because they want to create problems, but because that gap represents uncertainty. And uncertainty in human interaction is rarely accidental. So when someone tells an empath that they are overthinking, or too sensitive, or reading into things that aren't there, what they are actually doing is dismissing a perceptual system that has been built over time through pattern recognition and emotional awareness. And the impact of that dismissal goes deeper than most people realize, because it forces the empath into a position where they must choose between trusting what they perceive or trusting what they are being told to believe. And that choice is not simple, because it is not just about a single interaction. It is about how they orient themselves in every future interaction. And this raises a question that is rarely asked, but deeply important. If someone consistently notices patterns that others overlook, if they detect misalignment before it becomes visible, if their predictions about behavior often turn out to be accurate, at what point does sensitivity stop being seen as a flaw and start being recognized as precision? And more importantly, why is the immediate response so often to correct the person who sees more ajash, instead of questioning the environment that requires less awareness to feel comfortable in? The reality is that heightened perception is inconvenient. It disrupts smooth narratives. It exposes inconsistencies that people would rather ignore. and it challenges the idea that everything is as simple as it appears, so it is easier to label the empath as sensitive than it is to confront the possibility that they are noticing something real, something subtle, something that does not fit neatly into what is being said, but exists clearly in how it is being expressed. And over time, this repeated dismissal begins to shape how the empath is perceived, not as someone who understands deeply, but as someone who reacts excessively, even though the opposite is often true. Because if you slow the interaction down, if you actually observe, rather than assume, you start to see that what looks like emotional intensity is often just accurate detection. What appears to be hesitation is often careful processing, and what is labeled as sensitivity is, in many cases, a refined awareness that most people have never developed, and the difference between those two interpretations changes everything, not just in how the empath is viewed, but in how they begin to view themselves, because once perception is consistently questioned, it does not disappear. It becomes something they start to doubt. And that is where the real shift begins. Not in how they feel, but in whether they trust what they feel at all. At the beginning, the empath does not withdraw. And this is the part most people fail to see clearly, because from the outside, it often looks like nothing is wrong, like the connection is still intact, like everything is being handled, but internally, something much more delicate is taking place. The empath leans in rather than pulling away. They become more careful with their words, more intentional in how they express themselves. They replay conversations in their mind, adjusting tone, refining language, searching for a way to be understood without creating friction. And this effort is not driven by fear. It is driven by a belief that clarity can resolve misalignment, that if something feels off, it must be possible to correct it through communication. So when they say something feels wrong, when they point out a shift in tone or a subtle inconsistency, they are not accusing, they are inviting, understanding, but what they receive in return often takes a very different form. Not curiosity, not reflection, but dismissal, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct, and it rarely presents itself as hostility. It comes in phrases that sound reasonable on the surface. You're overthinking. That's not what I meant. You're being too sensitive. Statements that seem harmless but carry a deeper implication. That the empath's internal experience is not valid, not accurate, not worth trusting. And this is where something begins to fracture, because the empath is not only processing the interaction, they are processing the response to their perception, and when that perception is consistently denied, they are forced into a psychological position that is difficult to sustain. On one side is what they feel, the patterns they notice, the emotional signals they register, and on the other side is the external reality being presented to them, one that contradicts their internal experience. And when those two realities do not align, the empath does not immediately reject the other person. Instead, they turn inward. They begin questioning themselves. This questioning does not happen loudly. It does not appear as a dramatic breakdown. It is quiet, almost invisible. They start to soften their conclusions, to reinterpret what they sensed, to give the benefit of the doubt even when their instincts are clear. And over time, this creates a subtle but significant shift. They begin to hesitate before trusting their own perception, not because it has failed them, but because it has been challenged enough times to feel uncertain. And this is how self-trust begins to erode. Not through one major event, but through repeated moments where their reality is replaced by someone else's version of it. There was a pattern I once observed where a person would express discomfort in a conversation, something small, almost insignificant, just a feeling that something didn't quite match. And instead of that being explored, it was dismissed quickly, redirected, minimized, and at first, the person accepted it. They adjusted. They moved on. But after several interactions, something changed. Not in their behavior outwardly, but in how they carried themselves afterward. They would leave conversations quieter, more reserved. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they were no longer sure if what they felt was something they were allowed to trust. And that uncertainty is more damaging than direct conflict because it removes the foundation they rely on to navigate relationships. As this continues, the empath begins to notice patterns, not just in the other person, but in themselves. They start recognizing how often they second-guess their instincts around certain individuals, how often they leave interactions feeling confused instead of understood, how often they replay moments trying to reconcile what they felt with what they were told was real. And this awareness becomes a turning point because it shifts the focus away from fixing the interaction and toward understanding the impact of the interaction on them. And once that awareness becomes clear, it introduces a question that is difficult to ignore, not about whether the other person is right or wrong, but about what it costs to keep overriding their own perception in order to maintain the connection, because each time they dismiss what they feel, each time they accept a version of reality that does not align with their internal experience, they move slightly further away from themselves. And while that distance is not immediately noticeable, it accumulates, it changes how they think, how they respond, how they trust. Eventually, the empath does not react faster or louder. They become more still, more observant. They stop trying to immediately resolve the gap between perception and explanation, not because the gap has disappeared, but because they are beginning to understand that the issue may not be a lack of clarity, but a lack of alignment, and that realization does not create confrontation. It creates distance, not physical distance at first, but psychological distance, a quiet step back that allows them to see the pattern without being fully immersed in it. And in that space, something begins to return. Not certainty about the other person, but clarity about themselves. A recognition that their perception has not changed, only their willingness to doubt it. And as that clarity strengthens, the need to constantly justify what they feel begins to fade. Not because they have found better words, but because they are starting to see that no amount of explanation can resolve a dynamic that requires them to continuously question their own reality. If you observe an empath in a relationship long enough, what first appears as generosity begins to reveal itself as something far more structured, because they are not simply giving, they are responding to signals that most people never consciously register. They notice the shift in someone's mood before it is expressed. They anticipate discomfort before it becomes visible, and they move toward it, not out of obligation, but out of a natural instinct to restore balance. And in a healthy environment, this creates depth, a sense of being understood, without needing to explain, a kind of connection that feels almost effortless. But that same mechanism, when placed in the wrong environment, becomes something else entirely, something that slowly begins to work against them. Because the moment another person, consciously or unconsciously, recognizes that the empath will continue to give regardless of what they receive in return. The dynamic starts to tilt, not dramatically, not in a way that demands immediate attention, but subtly, almost imperceptibly, at first. The empath reaches out a little more often, adjusts a little more quickly, carries a little more of the emotional weight, while the other person does slightly less, not out of cruelty necessarily, but because the system allows it. And this is where imbalance begins to take shape. Not through conflict, but through quiet asymmetry that compounds over time. What makes this particularly difficult to detect is that the empath is not tracking fairness in the beginning. They are not measuring effort or comparing contributions. They are focused on maintaining the connection, on preserving the emotional structure of the relationship, and because of that, they continue investing long after a more self-protective individual would have already stepped back. They extend understanding, they offer patience, they give space, and all of this feels natural to them because it aligns with how they are wired. But there is a limit to how long any system can operate without reciprocity before it begins to break down. The body recognizes this before the mind fully acknowledges it. A kind of fatigue starts to emerge, not the kind that comes from doing too much, but the kind that comes from giving into something that does not restore. A depletion that is difficult to explain because it is not tied to a single event, it is tied to a pattern. And at first, the empath does not assign blame externally. They turn inward again. They question their expectations. They adjust their standards. They tell themselves that maybe they are asking for too much, that maybe relationships are simply uneven, that maybe this is normal. And for a while, that narrative holds because it allows them to continue without confronting the imbalance directly. But patterns have a way of becoming undeniable when they repeat consistently enough, and the empath begins to notice details that were previously overlooked. Who initiates meaningful conversations, who shows up during difficult moments, who carries the responsibility of maintaining emotional connection. And these observations do not create immediate confrontation. They create recognition, a quiet but precise awareness that something fundamental is missing. Not effort entirely, but mutuality. And once that awareness becomes clear, it changes the way they engage, not as a strategy, but as a natural response to what they are experiencing. I remember watching a dynamic where one person consistently checked in, adjusted plans, offered support, maintained communication, while the other responded, but rarely initiated. And when the first person finally stopped reaching out as frequently, nothing replaced that effort. The connection did not stabilize, it weakened. Communication slowed, presence faded. And what became evident in that absence was not just the imbalance, but how much of the relationship had been sustained by one side alone. And that realization did not create anger. It created clarity because it answered a question that had been forming quietly for some time. At that point, the empath does not suddenly demand change or escalate the situation. They begin to withdraw their investment, not in a dramatic or visible way, but in small, deliberate shifts. They conserve energy, they stop overextending, they observe what happens when they are no longer compensating for the lack of reciprocity. And what they observe often confirms what they have already begun to understand, that the connection depended heavily on their willingness to carry it. And without that effort, it does not hold itself together. This is where the internal decision begins to take shape. not based on emotion alone, but on structure. They recognize that continuing in this dynamic would require ongoing self-abandonment, a constant willingness to give without receiving, to maintain without being supported. And while they are capable of enduring imbalance for a time, they are not willing to sustain it indefinitely once it becomes clear. Because at that point, it is no longer about misunderstanding. It is about what the relationship fundamentally is. And when that realization settles in fully, something inside them stops volunteering in the same way it used to, not out of resentment, not out of withdrawal as a tactic, but because the system they were operating within no longer makes sense to maintain. And when effort is no longer given automatically, what remains is not what was promised, but what was actually there all along. Most people believe that trust is built through words, through promises, through what is said clearly and directly. But for an empath, trust is not constructed from statements alone. It is formed through alignment, through the subtle consistency between what is expressed and what is demonstrated over time. And when those two elements begin to separate, even slightly, something shifts internally in a way that is difficult to reverse. Because once misalignment is detected, it cannot be unseen. And more importantly, it cannot be unfelt. At first, the inconsistency does not register as a problem. It registers as complexity. The empath assumes there is context. They are missing something they have not yet understood. So they remain patient. They observe. They allow space for things to settle because they do not default to suspicion, they default to interpretation. And this is often mistaken for naivety. But it is not a lack of awareness, it is a willingness to wait before drawing conclusions, a willingness to give the interaction time to reveal its true pattern. But when inconsistency repeats, when the same misalignment appears again and again without resolution, the experience changes. It is no longer something to be interpreted. It becomes something that must be tracked. And this is where the empath begins to move from experiencing the relationship to analyzing it, not out of preference, but out of necessity. They start comparing tone with timing, words with behavior, intention with outcome, trying to determine what is stable and what is not, what is real and what is performative. And this internal process, while precise, is not sustainable over long periods of time. I once observed a situation where someone would alternate between warmth and distance in a way that was subtle enough to avoid confrontation, but consistent enough to create confusion. One day, they were open, engaged, attentive. The next day, they were distant, unavailable, almost withdrawn. And when asked about it, they would provide explanations that sounded reasonable in isolation. But over time, the pattern became clear, the explanations changed, but the inconsistency did not. And what made it particularly difficult for the empath involved was not the behavior itself, but the gap between the behavior and the narrative surrounding it, because inconsistency does not just create doubt, it creates disorientation. And disorientation is far more destabilizing than a clear negative signal. A direct betrayal can be identified, defined, confronted, but mixed signals operate differently. They keep the empath engaged in a cycle of interpretation, trying to resolve the contradiction, trying to understand how two opposing realities can exist at the same time. And this process extends the lifespan of the connection far beyond what clarity would allow. Because as long as there is ambiguity, there is something to solve. And that is why empaths often stay longer than expected in inconsistent dynamics. not because they are convinced everything is fine, but because they are still trying to make sense of what does not align. They are looking for a stable version of the person, a consistent pattern they can trust. And each moment of warmth reinforces the possibility that the inconsistency is temporary, that it can be resolved, that it is not the true nature of the connection, but over time, the effort required to maintain that interpretation begins to outweigh the connection itself, because trust, for an empath, is not built on intensity, it is built on predictability. Not rigid predictability, but enough consistency that they do not have to question every interaction, enough alignment that they can relax into the connection without constantly monitoring for change. And when that baseline is missing, when each interaction requires recalibration, when each conversation feels like it needs to be decoded, the relationship shifts from something that is experienced to something that is managed, and no one can remain in a state of constant management without eventually becoming exhausted. Because the mind was not designed to continuously interpret another person's behavior at that level of detail, especially not in a space that is supposed to feel safe. So the empath begins to reduce that effort, not as a conscious decision at first, but as a response to the cognitive load. They stop asking as many questions. They stop seeking reassurance that has not proven reliable. They begin to accept that the inconsistency is not an anomaly, but a feature of the dynamic. This realization changes the framework entirely, because once inconsistency is understood as structural rather than situational, the need to resolve it disappears. Not because the empath has found clarity in the other person, but because they have found clarity in the pattern itself, and that clarity leads to a simple conclusion, one that does not require further analysis. If a connection demands constant interpretation to be maintained, then it cannot provide the stability that trust depends on, and when that conclusion settles in, the empath does not confront with urgency. They do not escalate in search of answers. They begin to step back, not out of confusion, but out of resolution. They shift their focus away from trying to make sense of the other person and toward preserving their own clarity. Because in the absence of consistency, clarity becomes the only stable ground they have. And once they choose that ground, the connection no longer holds the same position it once did. Not because it ended suddenly, but because it lost the one thing that allowed it to exist without question. If you trace everything back far enough, past the misunderstandings, past the imbalance, past the inconsistency, it all converges on one underlying condition that determines whether an empath stays or leaves. And that condition is not agreement, not comfort, not even emotional closeness. It is safety. Specifically, emotional safety, the ability to exist in a space without having to constantly question your own internal experience, without having to filter every thought, manage every reaction, or anticipate every shift in another person's behavior just to maintain stability. At the beginning, the empath does not define the situation in these terms. They do what they have always done. They adapt, they regulate themselves to maintain the connection. They become more patient, more measured, more aware of how their words might be received. They adjust tone, timing, delivery, not because they are being controlled, but because they are trying to create a version of the interaction that works, something sustainable, something that allows both people to remain connected without conflict escalating. And this process, when it exists within a stable environment, is effective. It strengthens the relationship It creates a rhythm that both people can rely on, but when the environment itself is unstable, when reactions are unpredictable, when communication shifts without warning, when emotional responses feel disproportionate or even punitive, that same adaptive behavior begins to strain the empath's internal system because instead of creating harmony, it becomes a continuous effort to prevent disruption. And over time, the empath's nervous system starts to register this pattern, not as a temporary challenge, but as ongoing exposure to something that does not feel secure, something that requires constant adjustment just to avoid conflict or confusion. This shift is not always recognized consciously at first. The empath may still engage, still show up, still participate in conversations. But internally, something has already changed. They are no longer relaxed. They are no longer fully present in the same way. They are monitoring, scanning, anticipating, filtering, managing their responses in real time. And this state, while controlled on the surface, is fundamentally different from genuine connection, because connection allows for ease, for openness, for a natural flow of interaction, whereas this state is structured around preservation, around maintaining equilibrium in an environment that does not provide it naturally. I remember observing a dynamic where one person would enter a conversation already adjusting, already measuring their words before they spoke, already predicting how the other person might react. And while nothing overtly negative was happening in that moment, the level of internal regulation required to sustain the interaction was evident, and over time, that kind of engagement becomes unsustainable, not because the empath lacks capacity, but because the cost of maintaining that level of awareness in an unstable environment continues to accumulate. Eventually, the empath begins to shift their focus, not outwardly at first, but internally. They start asking a different question. Not, how do I make this work? Not, how do I explain this better? But what is this doing to me? What is the impact of staying in a space where I cannot fully trust my own experience, where I cannot relax into who I am without first assessing the potential consequences? And this question introduces a level of clarity that is difficult to ignore because it moves the evaluation away from the other person's intentions and toward the effect of the dynamic itself. Once that evaluation becomes honest, the conclusion that follows is not emotional in the way most people expect. It is structural. It is based on accumulated data, repeated experiences that have demonstrated a consistent lack of safety, and when that pattern is clear, the empath does not need further confirmation. They do not need a final incident or a dramatic moment to justify a decision, because the decision has already been forming over time, shaped by every interaction that required them to override their own sense of stability. From the outside, what happens next can seem abrupt. Communication decreases. Explanations stop. Access becomes limited. And eventually, the empath withdraws completely, not partially, not conditionally, but in a way that closes the loop entirely. And this is often interpreted as coldness or detachment, as if the empath has suddenly changed. But internally, the process has been gradual, deliberate, and deeply aligned with their need to restore balance. They do not leave to create a reaction. They do not withdraw to punish. They withdraw because staying would require them to continue negotiating with their own well-being. And that is the one negotiation they are no longer willing to engage in, because by this point, They have already experienced what it feels like to remain in a connection that lacks safety. They have already felt the confusion, the exhaustion, the quiet erosion of self-trust, and once that awareness is fully integrated, the idea of returning to that state no longer holds any appeal, so when they finally step away, it does not feel like loss in the way others expect. It feels like restoration, like returning to a baseline that had been gradually compromised, like reclaiming a sense of internal clarity that does not depend on another person's consistency. And in that space, something becomes evident without needing to be stated directly. That being alone is not the same as being isolated, and that a connection without safety was never truly connection to begin with.